They kicked me out when I was 19 and told me to figure life out on my own. Years later, when I finally did, they came back with a demand, not an apology, not regret, just an expectation that I'd sacrifice everything for them. I was born in Ohio in the late 80s, the oldest child in a family that liked to think of itself as close. My father worked construction until his knees gave out. My mother stayed home when we were young, then picked up part-time jobs once my sister was old enough for school. I did well in class, stayed out of trouble, and learned early that being self-sufficient earned praise faster than needing help. By the time I was 18, I understood that love in my house was quiet and conditional, expressed more through expectations than affection. I moved out at 19. It wasn't dramatic at first. No screaming, no slammed doors. Just a growing sense that there wasn't space for me anymore. My parents had decided my sister needed the larger bedroom because she was still finding herself. I was told it would only be temporary. Then my things started getting moved without asking. My mail went missing. My presence became inconvenient. The night I finally left, my father stood in the doorway of my room with his arms crossed and said, "If you're going to live here, you need to remember this is our house." I nodded, packed 2 bags, and slept on a friend's couch that night. No one tried to stop me. For years after that, my relationship with my parents existed in careful fragments. Holiday dinners, birthday calls, occasional updates about my sister, how she was stressed, how she was struggling, how she needed support. She was always on the edge of something. Finishing school, dropping out of school, finding herself, losing herself, starting over. I learned not to ask questions. I built my life quietly. College first, then work. I was good at what I did. Numbers, systems, long hours that rewarded focus and discipline. I didn't talk much about money, mostly because I remembered what it felt like to need it. By my mid-30s, I was doing better than anyone in my family ever had. Not flashy rich, just secure. The kind of rich where emergencies didn't feel like disasters. That was when the tone of the phone calls changed. My mother started asking more personal questions. How was work really? Was I tired? Did I ever think about buying property? My father talked about the housing market like it was a shared hobby. My sister, who rarely called me directly, suddenly started texting. Casual things at first. Memes. Complaints. Small talk that felt unfamiliar. I didn't connect the dots until the dinner. They invited me over on a Sunday. Said they missed me. Said it had been too long since we'd all been together. I noticed my old room had been converted into storage. No chair for me at the table, just one pulled in at the end. My mother served roast chicken and kept smiling too much. Halfway through the meal, my father cleared his throat. He had that tone, the one he used when he'd already made a decision and was now explaining it to someone he expected to comply. "You've done really well for yourself," he said. I thanked him. It felt strange hearing approval framed like an opening statement. My mother reached for her water, then set it down without drinking. "Your sister's been having a hard time," she said. I nodded. Of course she had. "She and Mark broke up," my father continued. Again. "She can't keep renting," my mother said quickly. "It's unstable and stressful, and she needs to focus on healing, not worrying about landlords." I waited. Something in my chest tightened, the way it used to when I was a kid, and sensed a punishment coming, but didn't know why. My father leaned back. "We think it would be best if you bought her a house." The words landed cleanly. No apology. No hesitation. Just expectation. I laughed. Once, because my brain needed time to catch up. "You mean, help her with a down payment?" "No," my mother said. "Buy it. You can afford it." The room felt very quiet. I noticed details I hadn't before. The chipped edge of the table, the hum of the refrigerator, the way my sister wouldn't look at me. "And," my father added, "until she's back on her feet, you'd cover her expenses. Just basics. Mortgage, utilities, groceries." I stared at him. "You're serious?" "Family takes care of family," my mother said. She said it gently, like a reminder, not a demand. I thought about the night I'd packed my bags. About my father's crossed arms. About being told this wasn't my house. "You kicked me out," I said quietly. My mother frowned. "That's not how it happened." "It is," I said. "You told me if I didn't like the rules, I could leave. So I did." My father waved a hand. "That was years ago. This is different." I looked at my sister then. She was scrolling on her phone, thumb moving slowly, like this conversation was happening somewhere else. "Did you know about this?" I asked her. She shrugged. Mom said you'd probably help. Probably. I felt something shift inside me, not anger exactly. More like clarity. A long, slow understanding that this wasn't about need. It was about hierarchy. About who was expected to give and who was expected to be carried. I'm not doing that, I said. My mother's smile disappeared. Don't be selfish. My father's voice hardened. You owe this family. I stood up, chair scraping against the floor. I don't, I said. And I won't. No one followed me to the door. I drove home in silence, hands steady on the wheel, heart doing something strange and heavy in my chest. I knew this wasn't over. I could feel it settling in, like a storm that had only just announced itself. And for the first time in a long while, I understood that walking away once hadn't been enough. I didn't hear from them for 3 days after that dinner. No calls, no texts. The silence felt deliberate, like a pause meant to make me uneasy. It didn't work the way they probably hoped. If anything, it gave me room to think. On the 4th day, my mother called. I was at work, halfway through a meeting, when my phone buzzed. I ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. By the time the meeting ended, there were 4 missed calls and 1 voicemail. I listened to it in the stairwell. Her voice was tight, controlled in that way that meant she'd already rehearsed. She said she was hurt. She said she didn't recognize me anymore. She said my sister had been crying for days and didn't understand why I was being so cold. I deleted the voicemail and went back to my desk. That night, my father called. He didn't leave a message. The next morning, my sister texted. I can't believe you'd do this to me. No greeting. No context. Just accusation. I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. Do what? The reply came almost immediately. You know I'm struggling. You know Mom and Dad can't help like you can. Why are you punishing me? Punishing. That word stayed with me all day. I thought about the years she'd lived at home rent-free while I scraped by. About the way my parents framed my independence as proof that I didn't need them, while her dependence was proof that she did. About how often I'd been told to be the bigger person, even when no one else was trying to grow. That evening, I finally called my mother back. She answered on the first ring, like she'd been holding the phone. I'm glad you came to your senses, she said. I didn't, I replied. I just want to be clear. She sighed dramatically. I don't know where this hostility is coming from. I closed my eyes. You asked me to buy my sister a house. Yes, she said, like that explained everything. And support her indefinitely. She's family. So am I. There was a pause. Then, softer, this isn't about you. That was the moment something inside me went still. It always is, I said. She told me I was being defensive. That money had changed me. That I was forgetting where I came from. She reminded me of all the sacrifices they'd made, the years they'd struggled, the roof they'd put over my head. I reminded her how quickly that roof had been taken away. That was different, she said again. It always was. By the end of the call, she was crying and I was tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. She said she hoped I'd do the right thing. I said goodbye and meant it. The pressure escalated after that. My father showed up at my apartment unannounced the following weekend. I opened the door and saw him standing there with his hands in his pockets, eyes already narrowed. We need to talk, he said. No, I replied. You need to leave. He stepped forward anyway. You don't get to walk away from this. I laughed, short and humorless. I walked away years ago. You just didn't notice. He accused me of hoarding wealth, of abandoning my responsibilities, of thinking I was better than them now. I am better off, I said calmly. That doesn't make me responsible for your decisions. He stared at me like I'd slapped him. She's your sister, and you're her parents. That was when his voice dropped. If you don't help her, don't bother calling us again. There it was. The threat I'd been expecting. I held the door open. Okay. He left without another word. The fallout was immediate. My sister posted vague things online about betrayal and greed. My aunt messaged me, asking what was going on. A cousin I barely spoke to sent a long paragraph about family unity and forgiveness. I stopped responding. Weeks passed. The noise faded, replaced by a dull background awareness that something fundamental had shifted. I slept better. I ate regularly. I noticed how quiet my life was without the constant undercurrent of obligation. Then, one evening, my sister showed up. I heard the knock and knew it was her before I opened the door. Same rhythm, same impatience. She looked smaller than I remembered, tired, but her eyes were sharp. So this is it, she said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. You just cut us off? I didn't, I said. I set a boundary. She scoffed. Must be nice to afford those. I didn't take the bait. What do you want? She crossed her arms. Mom said you wouldn't even listen. I didn't believe her. And now? She hesitated, just for a second. I need help. Now we need help. I need help. I waited. My lease is up, she said. I can't renew. The landlord's raising rent. I don't have enough saved. I nodded. That sounds stressful. That's it, she snapped. You're not even going to offer? I met her gaze. I can help you find resources. Budgeting tools. Maybe a roommate situation. Her face twisted. I don't want advice. I want support. Those aren't the same thing. She shook her head slowly. You've changed. Yeah, I said. I had to. She accused me of abandoning her, of punishing her for being different, of resenting her for things that weren't her fault. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, she was breathing hard, like she'd run a long distance. I'm not your safety net, I said quietly, and I never agreed to be. She left angry, slammed the door hard enough that a picture frame rattled. That night, I sat on my couch and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not because I'd hurt her, but because I hadn't folded. The next call came a month later. My mother again. Her tone was different, less sharp, more desperate. Your sister's been depressed, she said. She might have to move back home. I didn't respond. We just thought, she continued, that since you're alone and you have space. No, I said. Silence. I raised you better than this, she whispered. You raised me to survive, I replied. I did. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something closer to grief. I realized then that I wasn't just saying no to money. I was saying no to a role I'd been cast in before I understood I had a choice. And they weren't going to forgive me for it. That understanding settled deep in my chest as the night went on. It didn't hurt the way I'd expected. It felt steady, like standing my ground for the first time and realizing the earth didn't crack beneath my feet. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. Families like mine didn't let go easily. After that call, I stopped answering altogether. At first, it felt extreme. I'd never been the type to ignore people. Even when I was angry, I usually explained myself, tried to make things make sense. Silence felt rude, immature, like giving up. But every time I imagined picking up the phone, I could already hear how the conversation would go. The disappointment, the guilt, the careful way my words would be twisted until they sounded selfish. So I let the silence stand. Life didn't collapse the way I'd been warned it would. No sudden loneliness. No regret spirals. If anything, the days became easier, quieter. I cooked more, went on longer walks after work. I noticed how my shoulders sat lower, how my jaw wasn't clenched all the time anymore. Still, the story didn't end just because I stepped out of it. My aunt called one afternoon. Not to lecture, she never did. She asked how I was, really. I told her the truth. That I was okay. That I was tired. That I didn't think my parents would ever understand why this line mattered. They don't have to understand, she said. They just have to respect it. I laughed softly. They've never been good at that. No, she agreed. But that doesn't mean you're wrong. A week later, my father emailed me. The subject line was family matters. I almost didn't open it. But curiosity has a way of creeping in when you least expect it. I told myself I'd read it once and then decide. It was long, formal, carefully structured, like a business proposal disguised as concern. He wrote about legacy, about responsibility, about how families were supposed to function when one member succeeded. He reminded me that they'd struggled so I wouldn't have to, that my success wasn't just mine, it was ours. Then he laid it out plainly. They weren't asking for charity. They were asking for investment. A house in my sister's name, but with my backing. Support until she stabilized. In return, they promised things would be different this time. More appreciation, more respect. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time. Different this time. I thought about how many times I'd heard that phrase growing up. How often it had been used to smooth over patterns instead of breaking them. How many promises had been made once consequences appeared. I didn't respond. 2 days later, my sister emailed me from an address I didn't recognize. Her tone was different too. Softer. Measured. She wrote that she'd been doing a lot of thinking. That she realized things had been unfair to me. That she didn't mean to make me feel used. She said she didn't expect me to buy her a house anymore. Just help her get through this rough patch. A few months. 6 at most. She ended it with, I miss my brother. That line hit harder than I expected. Not because it was true, but because I'd missed the idea of her too. The version of my sister I'd imagined might exist if we weren't always placed on opposite sides of the same expectations. I typed out a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Eventually, I wrote something simple. I hope you land on your feet. I can't be the one to carry you there. I stared at it for a full minute before sending. Her reply came hours later. Wow, guess money really did change you. I didn't answer. That night, I dreamed I was back in my childhood home. The walls were the same, but the rooms were empty. Every door I opened led nowhere. When I woke up, my chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath in my sleep. The pressure resurfaced in subtler ways after that. Friends of my parents reached out under the guise of concern. Old neighbors messaged me about how proud they'd always been of me, followed by gentle reminders that family is all you have in the end. A distant cousin sent me an article about successful siblings supporting one another. I stopped opening messages from unknown numbers. It would have been easier if there'd been one explosive confrontation, one moment where everything burned and I could walk away knowing it was over. Instead, it was erosion. Small attempts to wear me down, to make my boundary feel unreasonable through repetition alone. The hardest part wasn't saying no. It was sitting with the doubt afterward. There were nights I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if I'd gone too far. If I could have offered something without giving everything. If being firm meant being cruel. On one of those nights, I pulled out an old photo album I'd brought with me when I moved out. There was a picture of me at 16, standing in the driveway next to my first car. I looked proud, tired, already older than I should have been. I remembered how I'd paid for half of that car myself. How my father had said it would build character. How my sister had gotten a newer one a year later because hers was safer. I closed the album. A month passed, then another. Just when I thought things were finally quiet, my mother showed up at my apartment. She looked smaller than I remembered too. Her hair was thinner, her eyes red-rimmed like she hadn't been sleeping. I didn't invite her in, but she stepped inside anyway. "You look well," she said, glancing around. "This place suits you. Why are you here?" I asked. She took a breath, steadying herself. "Your sister's moving back home." I nodded. "Okay." "She's devastated," my mother continued. "She feels abandoned." I waited. "She says you won't even talk to her anymore." I told her what I could offer, I replied. She didn't want it. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "You could do so much more." There it was again. I gestured toward the door. "If you're here to argue, this isn't the place." Her voice broke then. "I don't understand why you're being like this." I looked at her carefully. At the woman who'd taught me how to tie my shoes. Who'd also watched me pack my bags without saying a word. "I'm being like this," I said slowly, "because no one else ever was." She stared at me, confusion and hurt mixing in her expression. "You don't see it," I continued. "You never did. I was only valuable when I didn't need anything. The moment I did, I was inconvenient." "That's not true," she whispered. "It is," I said. "And this," I gestured vaguely, "between us. This is just the adult version of the same thing." She cried quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears sliding down her face while she stood in my living room. For a moment, I almost caved, almost told her I'd help, almost reached for that familiar role of peacemaker, provider, problem solver. Instead, I stayed still. "I love you," I said, "but I'm done sacrificing myself to prove it." She left without another word. After she was gone, I sat on the floor for a long time. The apartment felt larger, emptier, but it also felt honest. I didn't know what would come next. I only knew that the line I'd drawn wasn't temporary anymore. It wasn't a negotiation tactic or a phase. It was a decision. And somewhere deep down, beneath the grief and the doubt, there was something else taking root. A sense that for the first time, my life actually belonged to me. I suspected they weren't finished trying, but I was finished explaining. The strange thing about standing your ground is that the world doesn't applaud when you do it. There's no signal flare, no moment where everyone suddenly understands and adjusts. Most of the time, nothing happens at all. Life keeps moving. Bills still come due. Work deadlines still exist. The silence just stretches longer, thinner, until you start to wonder if this is what peace is supposed to feel like. For a while it was. Then the consequences started showing up in other people. I heard through my aunt that my parents were struggling more than they let on. My sister wasn't adjusting well to being back home. There were fights, shouting matches, long nights where no one slept. My mother had started complaining about headaches. My father's temper, which had always lived just under the surface, was now openly sharp. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want them. But knowing didn't stop it from weighing on me. There were moments, usually late at night, when I'd sit on my balcony and stare at the lights from other apartments and wonder if I was doing the right thing. I'd imagine alternate versions of myself, one who agreed to help, who bought the house, who wrote the checks. In those versions, the conflict ended quickly. My parents were relieved. My sister was grateful. The family narrative smoothed itself out. But in every version, I was still tired. That was the part one couldn't ignore anymore. Even in my imagination, I was exhausted, carrying resentment quietly, swallowing it the way I always had. I started therapy around that time. Not because I was falling apart, but because I didn't want to repeat old patterns under a new name. The therapist asked me early on why saying no felt so dangerous. Because it makes me disposable, I said without thinking. She didn't rush to respond. She just nodded, like that answer made sense. A few weeks later, my father tried again. This time, he didn't call or email. He sent a letter. It arrived in a plain envelope, my name written in his careful, blocky handwriting. I recognized it instantly. I almost threw it away unopened. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and opened it slowly, like the paper might bite. He wrote about pride, about how he'd worked his whole life so his children wouldn't struggle, about how it felt like failure to watch one succeed while the other floundered. Then came the part that changed everything. He wrote that my sister was depressed, that she barely left her room, that she cried at night and talked about being a burden. He wrote that my mother blamed herself, that the house was tense, heavy with regret. And then, finally, he wrote this. If something happens to her, I don't know how we'd live with ourselves. Or how you would. I read that sentence 3 times. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. What I felt was something colder. Something clear. He wasn't asking for help anymore. He was trying to make me responsible for the outcome. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Then I put it in a drawer where it stayed. I didn't respond. The next escalation came faster than I expected. One evening, my sister called from a private number. I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying. "Are you happy now?" she asked. "I don't know what you want me to say," I replied. "I want you to help me," she said. "I don't know how to do this on my own." "You've never had to," I said gently. She went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was sharp. "So that's it. You're just going to watch me fail." "I'm not watching," I said. "I'm stepping back." "That's the same thing." "No," I replied. "It isn't." She told me I was cruel, that I'd abandoned her, that money had made me arrogant. She said she hoped I never needed help the way she did. I listened. When she finished, I said, "I hope you find your footing." Then I hung up. I sat there afterward, phone still in my hand, staring at the dark screen. I expected to feel guilt, panic, something that would force me to call back. What I felt instead was sadness, not for her situation, but for the relationship we never really had. The one that might have existed if neither of us had been cast in roles we didn't choose. A week later, my parents made their final move. They invited extended family over for dinner. I wasn't invited, but the message reached me anyway. My aunt called the next day. She sounded angry, which was rare for her. "They told everyone you've abandoned the family," she said, "that you've turned your back on them because you think you're better than everyone else." I exhaled slowly. "Did you correct them?" "Yes," she said, "but the damage is done." Apparently, my parents had framed the situation carefully. They didn't mention kicking me out, didn't mention demanding a house. They spoke about hardship, about desperation, about a son who'd forgotten his roots. Some people believed them, others didn't. Most stayed neutral. I felt something shift then, not in my chest, but in my expectations. I realized I'd been holding on to the hope that if I stayed calm and reasonable, the truth would eventually speak for itself. That someone would step in and say, "This isn't fair." But families don't work that way. Narratives harden quickly, especially when they protect comfort. That night, I blocked my parents' numbers. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't announce it. I didn't write a final message explaining myself one last time. I just stopped leaving the door open. The quiet that followed was different from before. Deeper, heavier, but also cleaner. Weeks passed without contact. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from my aunt. "They're selling the house," she said. I closed my eyes. "Okay. They're saying it's temporary. That once your sister gets back on her feet, they'll figure something out." I didn't respond. They still think you'll step in eventually, she added. They think you'll feel guilty enough. I thought about the letter in my drawer. About that line, or how you would. I won't, I said. My aunt was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I believe you. That meant more than I expected. That night, I went through the drawer and took out the letter. I read it one last time. Then I shredded it slowly, piece by piece, until the words were unrecognizable. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for the next move. I wasn't bracing for the next demand or accusation. I was done playing defense. I knew there would be fallout, that people would misunderstand, that some bridges would never be rebuilt. But I also knew something else, something quiet and steady beneath it all. If I gave in now, I'd spend the rest of my life being asked to disappear for the sake of someone else's comfort. And I had finally learned the cost of that. So I let the silence stay. And this time, I meant it. The first real silence lasted almost 2 months. Not the passive kind, where you know someone is waiting for you to blink first. This was different. No new numbers calling. No emails slipping past filters. No messages delivered through relatives acting as messengers. Just absence. At first, I kept expecting something to break it. A medical emergency. A crisis big enough to justify crossing the line I'd drawn. I realized how trained I was to anticipate disaster, how deeply ingrained it was to believe that peace was temporary and conditional. Nothing happened. My days settled into a rhythm I hadn't known before. Work, exercise, dinner, sleep. Weekends that belonged entirely to me. I started taking day trips. Nothing elaborate, just long drives with no destination, stopping when something looked interesting. I hadn't realized how rarely I'd made decisions without mentally checking how they might affect someone else. Therapy shifted too. We stopped talking about my family as much and started talking about me. What I wanted my life to look like without the constant gravitational pull of obligation. That question unsettled me more than I expected. When you spend most of your life responding to needs that aren't yours, desire becomes abstract. I was good at responsibility, good at problem solving. Wanting something purely because it felt right was unfamiliar. Then the silence cracked. It wasn't my parents this time. It was a lawyer. He left a voicemail asking me to call back regarding a family financial matter. He said my name carefully, like he'd practiced it. I didn't return the call that day, or the next. On the third day, I listened to the voicemail again. Something about his tone bothered me. Not urgent, not threatening, just procedural. I called back. He explained that my parents were restructuring their finances, downsizing assets, selling the house. He said they'd listed my sister as a dependent again, which affected certain filings. Then he paused. They mentioned you, he said, as a potential guarantor. I felt my jaw tighten. I never agreed to that. I'm aware, he said quickly. That's why I'm calling. They implied verbal support. I wanted to confirm before proceeding. No, I said. There is no support, verbal or otherwise. He thanked me for the clarification. Professional. Neutral. After the call, I sat very still. It hadn't stopped. Even after everything, they were still trying to move pieces into place around me, assuming I'd eventually step into the shape they needed. That night, my mother emailed me for the first time since I blocked her number. A long message. Apologetic in tone, but not in substance. She wrote about stress, about fear, about how everything had spiraled faster than they expected. She said she never meant for things to get so bad. Then she wrote, "We wouldn't be here if you'd helped when we asked." I didn't reply. A week later, my aunt came to visit. She sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug, and told me what had finally happened. The house was sold. Not for much. Enough to clear some debts. Not enough to reset anything. My parents were renting a small place now. My sister was working part-time somewhere unstable. The tension hadn't gone away. It had turned inward. Blame was shifting. Voices were raised more often. They're angry, my aunt said. But they're also scared. I know, I replied. They still think this is temporary, she continued. That you'll come back and once reality hits hard enough. I stared at the steam rising from my coffee. What do you think? She didn't hesitate. I think they confused access with entitlement. And they're only realizing the difference now. That night, after she left, I opened a document on my laptop and started writing. Not a letter to them. Something else. I wrote down every time I'd been told to be the responsible one. Every instance where my needs had been minimized because I was strong. Every moment where help flowed in one direction only. I didn't write it to send. I wrote it to see it. By the time I finished, my hands were aching. My chest felt lighter. 2 weeks later, my sister showed up again. She didn't knock this time. She buzzed the intercom repeatedly until I answered. "I just want to talk," she said. Against my better judgment, I let her up. She looked worse. Thinner. Dark circles under her eyes. The edge in her posture had softened into something closer to defeat. "I'm not here to fight," she said quickly. I don't know what else to do." I didn't sit down. I stayed standing, giving myself an exit if I needed one. "I got denied for another apartment," she said. "My credit's bad. No savings. No cosigner." I waited. "They're selling everything," she added. "Mom's jewelry. Dad's tools. It's not enough." She looked at me then, really looked. I'm scared. I believed her. But belief didn't equal obligation. "I can't fix this for you," I said. "I'm not asking you to fix it," she replied. "Just help me breathe." I took a slow breath myself. "What does that mean?" She hesitated. "A loan. Temporary. I'll pay it back." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar. The framing had shifted. The expectation hadn't. "No," I said. Her eyes filled with tears. "You don't care." "That's not true," I replied. "But caring doesn't mean rescuing." She shook her head. "You're punishing us." "I'm not," I said. "I'm opting out." She stared at me like she didn't recognize the person in front of her. "Do you know how this makes you look?" she asked quietly. I thought about that. About the versions of me circulating in rooms I wasn't in. About the stories told in my absence. "Yes," I said. "I do. And you're okay with it?" I nodded. "I finally am." She left without yelling this time. No slammed doors. Just slow footsteps down the hallway. Afterward, I sat on the couch and felt the weight of the moment settle in. It hurt. Not in a sharp way. In a dull, aching one. The kind of hurt that comes from letting go of something you hoped might someday be different. But it didn't feel wrong. A few days later, I ran into an old friend from high school. We hadn't spoken in years. We got coffee and caught up on the surface-level stuff. Jobs. Relationships. Cities. At one point, she asked if I was close with my family. I hesitated, then said, "Not anymore." She nodded. "Yeah, same." There was no judgment in it. No advice. Just recognition. That was when it hit me how rare that had been in my life. How often I'd been expected to justify distance instead of closeness. The next message I received from my parents was short, almost curt. They said they were done asking. I believed them. Not because they'd accepted my choice, but because there was nothing left to leverage. The realization brought an unexpected wave of sadness. Not relief. Not triumph. Just the quiet understanding that the relationship I'd been trying to protect didn't exist the way I thought it did. And maybe never had. That night, I stood on my balcony again, city lights flickering below, and felt something settle into place. I hadn't won. I hadn't lost. I had simply stopped sacrificing myself to keep other people comfortable. And for the first time, that felt like enough. I knew there was still one thing left. One final moment where all of this would land. I didn't know when it would come. Only that it would. The final moment didn't arrive the way I imagined it would. There was no dramatic phone call in the middle of the night. No sudden apology. No last, desperate plea that forced everything into the open. It came quietly, almost mundanely, which somehow made it heavier. It was a certified letter. I found it wedged between junk mail and a grocery flyer, the envelope stiff and official. My name printed cleanly on the front. My parents' address in the corner. I stood in the hallway for a long time before opening it, already knowing this was meant to be the last move. Inside was a single page. They were updating their wills. That was it. No explanation beyond a paragraph written in careful, neutral language. Assets had changed. Circumstances had shifted. They wanted to be transparent. They said they hoped I understood. I sat on the edge of the couch and read it again. What they didn't say was louder than what they did. I was no longer part of the plan. Not because I had failed them, but because I hadn't complied. I felt something tighten in my chest, then loosen again. I'd spent so much time bracing for this moment that when it arrived, it felt strangely distant, like news about people I used to know. That night, I didn't call anyone. I didn't pace. I didn't pour a drink or stare at the ceiling. I cooked dinner, cleaned the kitchen, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. Grief doesn't always announce itself with pain. Sometimes it shows up as acceptance. A few weeks later, I ran into my sister for the last time. It happened by accident. A grocery store near my place. I recognized her voice before I saw her. She sounded tired, flat, stripped of the sharpness she used to carry like armor. We stood in the aisle for a moment, neither of us sure what to do. "You look good," she said finally. "So do you," I replied, even though it wasn't really true. She nodded like she knew that. "I heard about the letter. I figured you would." She hesitated. "They're not doing great." I met her eyes. "I know." There was a long pause. People moved around us, carts squeaking, shelves rattling softly. "I used to think you were just withholding," she said. "Like you were punishing us. And now," she swallowed, "now I think you just stopped bleeding." The word surprised me. I didn't know what to say. "I don't know how to fix things," she continued. "With them, or with you." "I don't either," I said. "And that's okay." She nodded slowly. "I'm trying to figure things out on my own." "I hope you do," I said, and meant it. We stood there a moment longer, then parted without hugging, without promises. Just two people acknowledging a shared past and separate futures. That was enough. Months passed. Life moved forward in ways that were quiet but real. I changed jobs, took on less overtime, traveled more, built routines that weren't shaped around crisis management or emotional cleanup. Sometimes, usually late at night, I thought about my parents, about how they must have told the story after I disappeared from it, about how they framed my absence as betrayal instead of boundary. I no longer felt the need to correct it. One evening, my therapist asked me what I'd learned through all of this. I didn't answer right away. "I learned that love without limits isn't love," I said finally. "It's control. And I learned that being useful isn't the same as being valued." She nodded, letting the silence stretch. "And," I added, "I learned that walking away doesn't mean you don't care. Sometimes it means you care enough not to disappear." That night, I stood on my balcony again, the same place where I'd once braced myself for impact. The city lights were steady below, indifferent and alive. I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who packed his bags at 19, who believed leaving meant failing, who thought love had to be earned through endurance. I wished I could tell him this. You don't owe your life to people who only see you as a solution. You're allowed to choose yourself without asking permission. The wind moved softly through the night. Somewhere below, a car horn sounded. Ordinary life, continuing. I went back inside, closed the door, and locked it, not out of fear, but out of intention. And for the first time, there was no one waiting on the other side.